Hi there, I'm Clifford Bates, and welcome once again to reading Carl Schmitt's Dictatorship. Today we're looking at chapter 3 of Dictatorship, which deals with the transition to the 17th century dictatorship in the 18th century. In other words, basically the concept of the sovereign dictator as defined in the 18th century state theory. In other words, again, this is the Germanic term state theory, is the kind of Riksstaat, this concept of state, the theory of state of the 18th century, the constitutional, the theory, the political construction of political science of the 18th century, the state theory of this in terms of what the state was, and this is the rise of the absolute state. This is you can see that it was earlier. You could say it happened earlier in the 17th century, but you see this in clear thing in the later half of the 17th century to the emergence of the 18th century. You have the emergence of what we call the sovereign state in that sense, particularly Louis XIV, French king, right? Um, we divide it in two parts. Pages up to page 92, we're going to be looking at it. So therefore, this is page 80 to 92 that deals with the first half, and this, which will mostly put Montesquieu, focus on the early Enlightenment, and then the later one, the later Enlightenment, in that sense, too. Particularly with Rousseau, right? The impact of Rousseau. So let's go look at the text, right? So the transition to sovereign dictatorship, right? It's from commissarial dictatorship to sovereign dictatorship, in that terms of the state. Now, the King of France, an absolutist king, governed through commissars. The intendant, who was in charge of royal administration, conformity, and centralization, les vrais agent of royal authority, right? This is, okay, let's do French. The true agent of royal authority, right, was a commissar. Um, First note, this is Gabriel Henriques. Then he's entered Ernest Lasave, another book, um, uh, uh, Pierre Sengat and Alexander de Saint-Delinguer about Louis XIV. He gives, four books deal with Leo XIV that he's read, right? Initially, the application intended was given to functionaries of the French Treasury, installed under Franz I, though they were either members of the Conseil or the uniformed people in their entourage or la suite. Their business was mainly in the nature of control and accountancy, although the Treasury was also in charge of ordinary and extraordinary matters pertaining to war administration, artillery, navy, and the administration of the royal court, etc. The exercise of control was gradually extended to the organizational functions. Therefore, it started with, in other words, he's saying that this function started with military matters and aspects of military matters, and then went and also the administration of the royal court, and then went to extend it to organizational functions. The authority of the commissaire departs. Department of police stations, Department of Police, the commissaries, departments, and intendants, as well as that of their subordinates, was suspended by law on 26 June 1790, at the very moment when the new administrative functions of the departments and districts came into effect. So the old rule, the authority of the commissaires department and the intendants, were done at the French Revolution, 1790, right? He says, just at the moment when the new administrative functions of the departments and districts came into effect. Through a decree of the National Convention of 24th November 1793, all the informal intendants were arrested and made to give an account for their activities, right? This is during the French Revolution in that sense. His official title was Commissaire de Part SM, Sa Majesté, dans les provinces et générale du royaume et pour part, in execution des orders du roi. So let's go the execution of the king. His official title was this, which means Commissioner to part of His Majesty in the provinces of the General of the Kingdom, So that's the intendant. This is the title for the execution of orders of the king. Right. He was the chief of a generalship, a province or a department. He could be recalled on each occasion as as his intendants stewardship, right? As an stewardship, his area of competence was not identical the other district, that of the other districts or of administration or jurisdiction, but of the governors and parliament. In other words, he had a specific jurisdiction of maintaining this authority, a stewardship in this sense. His area of competence was not identical to that of the other districts of administration and jurisdiction, that of the governors or parliament. Okay, the governors and parliament had different. Usually, only the matters of request, that is, members of the council, were considered eligible for the appointments in the border provinces, and this appointment was done through the superintendent of finances, who followed the suggestion by the minister of war. As a commissar, the intendant only had the forms of authority that resulted from his commission concerning both his own person and duty. The forms were different depending upon the different provinces and the personalities of the intendant. In difficult cases, he liaised with the headquarters for further instructions. Normally, he had to oversee the administration of the judiciary, police, and finances in the interest of maintaining public order. Right? He was also entrusted with the general overseeing, the inspection general, of everything related to the welfare of the king and his subjects. Distribution of collecting and taxes, monitoring the judiciary, deploying troops in different areas, recruiting troops, and making decisions regarding queries and quarrels occurred in this manner. So therefore, decisions regarding questions or quarrels that concern with the matters of regulating troops. In other words, recruiting troops and making decisions about about recruiting, how the troops recruited, right? Supplying corn for the storehouses. Let's see what this three says. Tenant in the capacity of commissaries must be distinguished from commissaries and the privileged assembly of corn. The latter were imprecisely called commissars in Wolf, in that sense. This is the distinction between the two offices. Setting the highest price in times of scarcity, the development of agriculture, trade, and industry, and the maintenance of the roads, bridges, and public buildings. In short, um, the good of the state. In other words, in le brin l'estat, in short, the good of the state. He had to report back to the commissioners, the king, and the council, and to inform them permanently about what was going on in his district, or what seemed to be in need of reform. By a special decree of the council, he was empowered to conduct investigations, to collect evidence, and to write report. Commissions that he himself conducted legal proceedings or to make judicial decisions were more rarely authorized. The rule was that he sh- that he himself should not decide. He only had to ensure that the officials would pass judgment in each case. So, in other words, he's collecting information, he's doing this, and regarding judicial decisions, he wasn't. He was wanting to make sure they were enforced, that they were done, that they were made in that sense, right? Um, the official court would pass judgment in each case. Even in disputes over taxation or the collection of taxation, he needed to delegate to the courts. So, in other words, he wasn't doing it by his own authority. The actual decision about this was often delegated to the courts. When public uprisings occurred, especially in frequent peasant riots during harvest, the provost of the gendarmerie or his lieutenant took decisions uh, 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 through an extraordinary procedure that excluded the possibility of appeal. So this is according the wording of the commission was followed. Instruct the provost of the marshallery, the gendarmerie, and his lieutenant to have knowledge of the state of mind and the forms of gatherings that may occur around harvest. Give orders that the process be done and perfected through them, judging in the matter suitable to the quality of the provost, and without possibility of appeal, and forbid his majesty to learn about it through any court of law. Homes were arbitrary, entered, people arrested, and so on. But on a court, but an ordinance was in place prescribing that arrested person had to be questioned by a judge within 24 hours. With regard to this ordinance, Tocqueville remarked in his Ancient Regime, this order was neither less formal nor more respected than it was in our own day. In a sense, in other words, it was not. It was like the idea. In other words, it was like in the contemporary day that he had to order to go in there, but then they had to be reviewed by a judge within a certain amount of time. Okay, and in other words, this order was neither less formal nor more respected than our day in that sense. In that sense, this idea here. The storehouses and setting high prices. Time State did that earlier. This is possibility of appeal. The intendant or his subdelegate frequently negotiated with the rebels. He even tried to mediate between workers on strikes and their employees in disputes over wages. Normally, he was not keen on using force, but proceeded with absolute precaution because it was recognized that prohibitions and police-like measures were not fruitful in such cases. In other words, Emile saw the history of the working classes before 1789. Right, it describes numerous cases of unrest among craftsmen assistants and workers, and the reader is told that a report in which a special decree against riots, assemblies, and special authorities for their implementations was marked in the margins of the phrase "nothing can be done about it." Okay, so therefore, in such cases, in other words, it wouldn't be fruitful. You had the right, you could use force. It wasn't, you should try to avoid it in that sense. When necessary, he acquired extraordinary powers from the council. Then he intervened with the support of the armed forces and took necessary measures, which he had to justify afterwards. From time to time, his function as a commissar of action was called a kind of dictatorship in contrast to his normal duty of monitoring and administering his executive authority, right? It's authority of the executive. The legal remedy against the intendant, appeal to council, had no validity unless the council had explicitly decided something else. The intendant appointed subdelegate, whom he had to pay out of his own pocket and could dismiss at any time, right? He resided in the capital of the district, but he had to undertake a journey of visitation at least once a year or twice under Cardinal Colbert. As an agent of the central power, he was naturally opposed to the provincial and local cooperatives, which had maintained for the most part an autonomous judiciary, government, and administration. But there were intendants who knew when to act with a good deal of autonomy towards the central government. But there were intendants who knew when to act with good authority, to act a good deal of autonomy towards the central government. Most of them, as commissars, were seen to be useful tools in the process of centralization, and therefore they were caught up in the conflict with the intermediate powers, the parliament, the estates, and the provincial capitals of their governors. These governors were originally appointed for lifetime, but in fact they occupied hereditary functions. In other words, they originally were only to be kind of lifetime positions, but then they became hereditary, right? The governors in that sense. In the very beginning, they were commanders of the army, so they were themselves, by definition, untenured commissars, according to the custom of that time. And in most of the cases, they appointed commissars in turn, commissaires intermédiaires commissars, even for the collection of taxes. The Assembly Constitute retained these commissaires temporarily for their function. They were distinguished from the commissaire additionnel, who participated in the administration at the king's whim. Decree 12, December 1789, in Dermis du Gouver's collection of that period, This office ceased to be as 31st December 1790. So again, it was from early on. There had been numerous attacks on the intendant as a representative of a centralized bureaucracy. The best known records of such an event are the memoirs of the Duke of Saint Simon and Francis Villon's letter to the Duke of Chevreuse in 1710. The attacks continued throughout the whole of the 18th century. Because of their number, the intendants were called elusively the 30 Tyrants. Okay, this is like okay, eight. C. Van der Aal's book on the French, the Prehistory of the French Revolution, with a reference to Pierre Dubois, the intendants on the sessions on Louis the 14th. Louis the 14th. Not it wasn't intended to. And Necker's book on the transformation of the traits. Okay, the treatise on the transformation of was it? Treatise on the financial administration of France. J. Necker's book on this. Beside the fact that the bureaucracy hindered access to the king, and that the king saw things only through the eyes of the representatives, the most important reason for complaint regarding breaches of the constitution was taxation ordered by the king without agreement of the estates. Okay, therefore this is the idea number 9. Here we find all the organic images that were so popular with Rousseau and the Revolution. The intendant of the king's or the consul's eyes. The consul itself was le pens or le vare, le pensée, thought, and the will. I think thought and willingness, will. The intendant is the arm or hands of the king insofar as he has authority to act, and so on. In other words, this pensées, le pensée, the arms, the means to do it, and the will, right? This idea, king's eyes, and this is the intendant for the king. The king is the ruling agency. Normally, the estates were granted an enormous flexibility in the distribution of flexibility in the distribution and collection of taxes. There had always been complaints against princely commissars and from the intermediate instances, that is, from the self-governing estates. In 1648, during the infancy of Louis XIV, the combined courts of Paris knew how to prevent the nominalization of sovereign intendants. Later on, of course, the commissions were partly renewed. Conciliary theory argued against the plenitude of powers of the Pope. Right, those who defended the councils argued against the powers of the Pope, claiming that it should not be exercised by him but by the Church, and that the Pope had, in consequence, to abstain from direct interference down the steps of the hierarchy in the ordinary responsibilities of the various departments. Okay, this is the argument of that. This is argument all the way back to the previous thing. We talked about this, and that this is chapter 1, discussion about this, how the Pope, this. Because in the same way, the German estates shared the view that it was not the emperor who had majesty, but the Reich. In Heinrich Hoff's 1642 dissertation, on the subject of double magistracy, right, which was supervised by Thomasson, and which Goethe does not mention in his outline of this doctrine. See Goethe's Johannes Eleutherium under, this is that Goethe's book on Johannes. Hold on. Yikes. Johannes in the development of natural law state theories, at the same time as contribution to the history of legal systemics. Right? Breslau, 1880. Although it is the great interest for the organic theory of the state in this sense, right? Grotius is once again revisited, namely in his idea that the people can transfer its entire right to someone else. Here is what one reads in section 18, following John Adams Oslander's. Okay. Oslander's observations, the most important part of the theology in the three books of the Law of War and Peace of Hugo Grotius, right? Who repeats the arguments brought from forward by James I of England against Bellarmine. The monarchs, just like Althuas, confused populace with civitas, the people with the civitas, and contrasted the people and the king, as if these were two separate things, and that the king were outside the state, when one in fact should say of the civitas that it okay, it encloses the king within it, and as it were in its entirety. Okay, again, what does he say? The monarchist, right, and like Anthony argues that confused the people in the Salvatas, in that sense, and contrasted the people with the king. Now, Grotius is saying that no, you can't do this. That really, in fact, one should say that the civitas encloses the king within it. So the king is not outside the civitas in that sense. The king is merely an instrument of this, is within it, in this God. Hence, the idea that the state comprises both king and people was already formulated in the 17th century, and the priority in this regard, that of Emil Mincer, of the doctrine of the monarchical principle, right? Vin, vindicates for Kepler, a deputy of Wundmager in 1819, on the strength of one statement. A complete and new groundbreaking statement is therefore questionable in that sense, right? So this is the old thing, right? The same way the emperor, in other words, the emperor, the same way the German states viewed it, that it was the emperor who had the magistracy, but not the emperor had the magistracy, but the Reich, the empire of which the emperor was merely a part. But in this area, the outcome was different, right? And when the French parliaments declared that the king was not beyond the state, but was himself a part of the kingdom, they were following the same principle in that sense, right? This is the idea. Le roi est de royaume appears. Okay, the king is in the kingdom, right? As it appears in the Parliament Resolution 12, December 1512, a formula cited in the Restroments of the Parliament of 9 April 1753. One can also find a distinction drawn between the sovereign, whose areas of authority should be limited, and sovereignty. By way, the king replied with the same unity. He issued threats against anyone who dared cut him off from the nation as a what is it, a separate body. In other words, cut him off from the nation as a separate body. In other words, nothing can separate. He and the body is one. He and the king is one, right? And he emphasized that he and the people form a unity. These are his famous words from the Elite de Justice of 1766. From this unity, he concluded that the plenitude of his authority, the totality, the plenitude of his authority must be unlimited. Therefore, the question was who was identified with the unity and who could enforce its identification politically. The problem is not resolved by saying either that both or that no one is superior, all embracing third party occupied this position in that sense. Um, they saw the ceiling of immediate powers as a sacred deposit, which bound the king's authority to the trust of the people. This is the parliaments, right? The parliament saw this was that the graduations of the scaling or the scaling or graduation, the different areas, scales of the immediate powers, right, as a sacred deposit, which bound the king's authority to the trust of the people in that sense, the kings and people together. Even in the 18th century, the autonomy of the estates in juridical and administrative matters was so dominant that the absolutism of the French kings could not be compared with that of Napoleon in that sense. In other words, 13. One can find a nice example of this in Franz Brunswick, the ancient France, right, and the king. So that the king, in other words, the authority of the estates and judicial and administrative matters was so dominant that the absolute of the French kings could not be compared with that of Napoleon. To a monarchist like Bonald, monarchy and hereditary immediate principles were identical, and the commissarial intendant seems to embody an institution contrary to the historic principle of monarchy. In particular, Montesquieu's theory of state theory, is only comprehensible if one bears in mind what was what was referred to in the most crucial part of his treatise was the idea of intermediate powers. Never forget the idea. In other words, his whole thing was the idea of intermediate powers. The tension between Montesquieu and the Enlightenment stems from this dispute, rife in the political and administrative realm, between the conservative autonomy of the estates, which involved a state power that was indirect, in other words, mediated by numerous independent bodies, and a direct central bureaucracy, which could interfere at any time. So therefore, this is the tension that Montesquieu and the Enlightenment, that Montesquieu's state theory, in this sense, argued for intermediate powers, the idea of importance of intermediate powers, and the danger of this. That therefore, this tension was between a system of intermediate powers and a centralized system. Let's do this line again. The tension between Montesquieu and the Enlightenment stems from the dispute rife in the political administrative realm between the conservative autonomy of the states, in which a state power was indirect, in other words, mediated by numerous independent bodies, or a direct central bureaucracy which could interfere at any time. Montesquieu was a member of Parliament. Targut, the most important representative of the theory of enlightened state absolutism among the physiocrats, arose from the ranks of the intendants. So therefore, in other words, Turgot and the physiocrat conceptions, right, absolutely comes from. So there, at this point, we see a battle between the Montesquieus who argued for immediate power and moderate power versus the monarchists who argued for a centralized and what do you call direct power, centralized and direct, right? The pouvoirs intermediate powers, were, according to Montesquieu, an essential element of monarchical government, and they represented the basic principle of law. The law needed a mediating institution through which governmental power could flow, so that an arbitrary and spontaneous expression of the will of the state could be prevented. In other words, the spontaneous expression of the will of the state could be prevented. So that, in other words, an arbitrary and spontaneous will. In other words, and you needed immediate institutions which could flow to prevent a centralizing authority, right? And let's go to despotic power. In other words, the difference in Montesquieu between despotic and that. In other words, that monarchy had to be kind of mediated. If it wasn't mediated, it would become despotic in character. Interesting. That would be interesting. That would even argue, but democracy is some of his criticisms of democracy having to be, but a democracy can only happen in small communities, and therefore there's no room for mediation. It can be tolerated in that sense, right? The law needing a mediating institution through which government power could flow. So an arbitrary and spontaneous expression of the will of the state could be prevented. The aristocracy, the similia, what is this? I'm going to get this. Look at this. No, there's no definition for it. Yeah. Maybe it's a translation because I think it's a name. I think this. I think it means those who authorize this and the patrimonial sphere of jurisdiction, the clergy and the independent law courts, which acted as a state house of the depot des lois, the depot, storehouse of the laws, and also the French parliaments, which were intermediate checks on the omnipotence of the state, but not so. But not so the councils of princes, which was naturally inclined to execute the immediate will of the prince without relying on um, uh, 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 um, the, the sacred deposit of the fundamental law. So therefore, it wouldn't rely on the fundamental law in that sense. But not so the Council of Princes, which was inclined to execute the immediate will of the prince without relying on the sacred deposit in that sense of the laws, of the fundamental laws. So therefore, where the parliaments were checking on omnipotent power, the councils of the princes and the intendants were not. Okay. Furthermore, it had the disadvantage of not being permanent. Furthermore, it had the disadvantage of not being permanent, like those intermediate corporations. Nor did it have the trust of the people. So the Montesquieu Spirit of the Laws, Book 2, Chapter 4. The intermediate powers, subordinate and dependent, constitute the nature of monarchical government. That is, the government where just one rules through the fundamental laws. I said intermediate powers, subordinate and dependent. In fact, in a monarchy, the prince is the source of all political and civilian power. These fundamental laws necessary presuppose middle channels through which power flows through. The monarch's council does not at all enjoy the trust of the public to the sufficient high degree. The passage in plain text are so-called cartoons, that is, amendments introduced by the censor for a comparison of the passage and the history of Montesquieu. The changes show that how the absolute government of the state tried to weaken the ideas of the estates in that sense. So far, Montesquieu is expressing the very same ideas that will return in the Remonstrances, and and he is a major opponent of the Enlightenment, as well as of Voltaire and the physiocrats, for whom the intended corporations and the heretical functions were barbarian or Gothic, as one would then say, exercise in futility and a disruption of the rational scheme of things. In other words, the physiocrats has wanted rational model, this idea of the rational, perfectly rational model, centralization, logical situation, centralization power. He argued for mediating systems. And reading, this is very interesting. Reading Schmitt on Montesquieu is probably showing an alternative. See, we can always see I mean, a lot of people will see Montesquieu as an Enlightenment thinker, an actor in agreement with the Enlightenment. But no, Schmitt is arguing for an anti-monarchist reading. Very interesting here about this. Therefore, Schmitt is suggesting that Montesquieu must be understood as a defender against centralization. And I think this is very powerful in that sense. Let me just continue this. I think this is interesting in that sense. Okay. Um, so against this is that and the Enlightenment conceived of the state the very same deistic metaphysics saw in the cosmos. God who resides outside this world created it in such a way that it functions of perfect machine, following laws given in advance. The lawmaker constructed the machine of the state in the same way. To illustrate this construction, Montesquieu employs a simile of balance, right? So therefore, he kind of presents this. He says, to illustrate this construction, Montesquieu employs a simile of balance. This metaphor analogy was commonly used in the 17th and 18th centuries to express all kinds of true harmony in the cosmos as well as in foreign and domestic policy, in ethics, and in national economy. And it was not necessarily understood in an abstract and rationalistic way. The theory of the so called separation of powers became incomprehensible for someone who places too much emphasis on separation and division rather than on the notion of balance. Right here, this is why. This is this idea. M. Hash has pointed out this fact, which is usually overlooked in German literature, apart from his major work. He did so mainly in his essay. Okay, this is 1916. Let's see what this says. Hold on, I'm gonna separation of powers and mixed forms of government. Quarterly Journal for Social and Economic History. Wow, this is interesting. In other words, it's in other words you have to. It's not in the absolute sense. It's not a. In other words, the purpose of separation of powers is not an absolute separation in that sense, but an idea of balancing in the sense. Very interesting point. Schmitt is a particularly striking example of such a misunderstanding is the controversy between Realm and Jelinek in Wilhelm's general theory of state, right, of Tulenberg, 1899. Jelinek, okay, a new theory of Montesquieu's doctrine of powers of the state in the Journal of Public and Private Law. Jelinek, whew, um, okay, this is eye opening in that sense. Um, I didn't, I never paid this close. I mean, I read this section a couple times, but never in this slow manner. And you can see Schmitt pointing out the real debate, and then even the history of German thinking have misunderstood Montesquieu here, in this sense that this is a debate of this. The separation of powers were kind of really misunderstood in this sense, right? Um, and therefore, which then was a response to Raum-Stadler and a rejoinder by Jelinek in his Schiffschiffer on page this. The simile of the scale, in other words, a scale, used since the 17th century in the English, in the American and Federalist Papers, and the French Declaration discussion of political problems arising from the relationship between the legislative and executive, parliament or king, federal state and individual state, House of Lords and the House of Commons, was attacked in the literature of the Restoration as a rationalistic idea. Wow! In other words, the Restoration looks at this. Oh, the separation of powers. This is rationalistic. No, it's not. It was pre-rationalistic. It was this idea of balance. It was a simile of this, the need of balance in that sense, and therefore these German thinkers saw it as rationalistic in reaction towards it. Okay, okay, very interesting point of this. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm So the notion of balance, right? A system of mutual checking, prevention, and cooperation needed to be established. Power checks power, as Montesquieu put it in Spirit of the Laws, book 11, chapter 4. This is the famous point, right? This idea of power. And the arbiter, the enchanter, and to stop, put in chains, tie, and hither are the key words of this famous chapter 6 of the same book. Again, that's again, this is famous chapter on England, right? The English Constitution, right? This idea of constraint, check, balance. Above all, the purpose of the simile of balance was to illustrate the conversation between the king and parliament. When a corporate body confronted the king, that is, the holder of the most important form of state power, it could only do this on the basis of an identification with the people it claimed to represent, and it and it also claimed and demanded to control the use of that state power, and to issue the rules for its use. In other words, the legislation. Uniformity could be achieved if one power annulled the other. In the terminology of the 18th century, that would be despotism. Today, it would be dictatorship. So this is the expression of 19th century Dessau, dictator, distant, dictators of the estate, and the philosophy of the Reichs. Okay, just let's get the book title. I'm sorry, I'm doing something. Philosophy of law from the historic perspective. See his the monarchical principle, Heidelberg, and then of state and church, and party was it on the current parties in church and state, 1618. Again, this is Stahl's work. I mean, that's what our ignorance of this. We don't. We have. Stahl was one of those important German legal theorists of the 1830s of this things that many of us simply just, if you don't know the German, I mean, I'm not a background, my own specialization and interest is not really, I'm not knowledgeable about German law to that degree. I just have a small inkling of this what I've learned from reading Stapler writers and things like this. So this is okay. This is very eye opening in that sense. So what he says that uniformity, this uniformity could be achieved by one power annulling of the other, but that would be despotism, right? Which we would call dictatorship. On the contrary, the simile of the balance symbolizes a unity achieved through consensus. Hence, the so-called separation of powers was nothing less than a doctrinal construct. In other words, that hence the so-called separation was a doctrine. This separation was always related to concrete political conditions, and it was implicit that the use was always directed at the one who, through his prejudicial claim to power, through his attempt this dictatorship, in other words, despotic power, use of power, disturbed the mutual exchange of arguments and made consensus impossible. So, therefore, this is the idea. This is a very, again, my God, this is outstanding point by Schmitt to understand Tocqueville, what we understand by this. This separation was always related to the concrete political conditions, and it was implicit that its use was always directed at the one who, through his prejudicial claim to power, therefore through his dictatorship, disturbed the mutual exchange of arguments that made consensus possible. And the separation was neither Republican nor Democratic, as the monarchical apologists of the 19th century were keen to claim. In other words, the monarchical apologists claimed that this was a republic. Oh, separation of powers, separation. Oh my God, this is okay. This is Schmitt. Is a very interesting point here. Nor was it a form of abstract rationalism. In fact, this is what Constance Franz believed in a crude misinterpretation, he saw Montesquieu as the intellectual founder of modern tendencies towards centralization in the modern state. Oh my God, this is like, okay, this is why he isn't that decentralization of this. And on that view, any imbalanced power, power, a superpower, any unbalanced political superpower is the enemy in that sense. In Cromwell's constitution, the separation appears as a means of preventing the abuse of power by the governing parliament. This is well known due to the long parliament. It was the first half of the 18th century. Bolingbroke emphasized the separation and the interest of a strong monarchy against the parliamentary majority of Whigs. Bolingbroke called Marlborough, the most influential man of that time, a dictator. Okay, this is very interesting. So Marlborough called it a dictator after the 1713 peace treaty of Utrecht, at the time when Addison Cato was staged in London, of 14 February 1713. Bolingbroke organized a political demonstration in which he used the classical pathos of freedom in the play as a protest for defending the cause of liberty against the perpetual dictator, that is, against Marlborough, who was then supposed to be Captain General for life. On these events, see A.W. Ward's History of the English Dramatic Literature and Macaulay's Life and Writing of Addison, and a biography of Bolingbroke in National Biographies. Of particular interest among Henry St. John Bolingbroke's works are A Discussion on the Parties, published in Craftsman, and The Idea of the Patriot King, published in London. So Bolingbroke. Oh my God, this is. This was the retort. This was in retort to the qualification despot, by which the Whigs designated the absolute prince. In other words, this was the retort to the qualification despot, by which the Whigs designated an absolute prince. Right, this idea. Montesquieu now combined the doctrine of balance with the doctrine of the intermediate corpus intermediaris, the intermediary bodies, right? Yeah, intermediate bodies, yes. In order to help in struggle against the dominance of royal absolutism and its instruments, and the ministers and his intendants. To the extent Montesquieu still maintained the tradition of the estates and set the intermediate powers against the king's power, a power that controlled all the instruments of the state, a king who could direct the whole state apparatus in one crypt. Il principe il balance. He shifts the balance. Spirit 3, Spirit 3, chapter 10. Right. Besides, contrary to the glorifying view of history, which was the norm, he did not regard Cardinal Richelieu, the founder of the centralizing power of the French kingship, a great man. He even had the courage, quite extraordinary in a man of the 18th century society, to quote appreciatively from Bolingbroke, the ancestral founders of the theories. In other words, the ancestor of the feudal theories of race. In other words, it was, again, the older view, this ideological offensive. That's like the feudal theories of race, and yet for him, direct democracy was open to the same criticism as absolute monarchy. The people should have no prussens intermediari in that sense. That's the words, that immediate power. The people would have no intermediate power. There were no intermediate powers in direct democracy of the ancient republic either. I got to this idea, the concept of intermediate powers in Montesquieu. Oh God, this is, and that's what the criticism of this is, the idea of intermediate powers. Oh, okay, this, jeez. Oh, in Montesquieu and the entire literature that influenced and the entire literature influenced by him, despotism means the suspension of the right of balance. In that sense, to a certain extent, it would have been even better to talk about a mediation, right, of the plenitude patente, okay, the full power, absolute, absolute power, than of in other words, mediating. Okay, yeah, that's the right tune. Mediating. This has become Schmitt's. Schmitt says the problem is balancing it is caught in other words, balancing it is different. It would have been better to talk about mediating, because he means this idea of the intermediate stage mediating things. This need to mediate constantly has to do, and therefore this idea of it's better to talk about mediating that of the full plenitude of powers rather than balancing of them. The omnipotent state should never be able to intervene arbitrarily with all of its effective plenitude of power. It should rather be arbitrated, mediated in the exercise of by an appropriate organ with well-defined authorities, a prévu bon, a limited power, whose authority, unlike that of the other mediating powers, cannot be suspended arbitrarily. So that's very important. It should be arbitrated, mediated in the exercise by an appropriate organ with well-defined authorities, limited power, a pourvoir bon, limited power, whose authority, unlike that of the other mediating powers, cannot be suspended arbitrarily. The highest powers, the legislative and executive, should similarly exercise control over each other's authority. So therefore, at the highest powers, the legislative should kind of similarly exercise control over each other. The result is that civil liberty is protected from the omnipotence of state power, of the state, which is regulated by a network of limited authorities. Whether the omnipotent organ is a corporate body or a omnipotent executive, or whether the instrument is of immediate omnipotence, the commissar with unlimited authority outside the unconditional dependence within are set by parliament or by princes is neither here nor there when it comes to the result. The result of the annihilation. So it doesn't matter who it is. Whether, in other words, if the result is the annihilation of civil liberty, it doesn't matter whether it's done by the parliament or by the prince. Okay? In other words, the commissar with unlimited authority outside the unconditional dependencies within it. In other words, he's saying that whether the omnipotent organ is a corporate body or an omnipotent executive, it doesn't matter. The result will be the destruction of civil liberty. This doctrine does not benefit from a formal concept of law. My God, this doctrine does not benefit from a formal concept of law. The concept of law does not make this any better. Does not benefit it. So if you're taking separation of powers theories and try to add, neo-Kantianism to it, you're going to fuck it up. That's the gist of what I see Schmitt arguing here. I think this has been like, oh my God, eye opening to a max. I don't know why I'm okay. Let me see. This does not, in other words, this doctrine does not benefit from a formal concept of a formal concept of law. The commitment of the state, which should be based on legislative and the inviolability of the law, is only guaranteed if the legislation and its execution mutually controls each other, and above all, if the law once passed cannot be changed arbitrarily. Hence the demand for royal vetoes. So again, this is this idea that, in other words, my God, this is again the commitment of the state, which should be based on legislation and the inviolability of the laws, is only guaranteed if the legislation and its execution is mutually controls each other. Hence why you need this. Otherwise, the alleged commitment that the legislature imposes on himself through law is merely an empty gesture. In theory, sovereignty may be uniform and unlimited, but in practice, every single officer must be given a limited authority, and even two highest institutions, the legislative and executive, should not be allowed to expand their authorities unilaterally. I'll repeat, this is powerful stuff. Schmitt. Liberals need to read this. If you're going to those who believe in liberty need to read what Schmitt's saying here, because my God, this is a direct attack to most of constitutional thinking of our time today, which is formalistic in law, the idea that law is trump, that there can be a body like that can be absolute authority that can over trump the Constitution and trump the laws. No, it can't be in this sense. So therefore, let's look at this in that sense. The commitment of the state, which should be based on legislative and inviolability laws, is guaranteed only if the legislation and its execution mutually controls one another. And above all, if a law once passed cannot be changed arbitrarily, hence the demand for royal vetoes. Otherwise, the alleged commitment that the legislature imposes on themselves through law is a merely empty gesture. In theory, sovereignty may be uniform and unlimited, but in practice, every single officer must be given limited authority, and even the two highest authorities, the legislative and executive, should not be allowed to expand their authorities unilaterally. There would be no responsibility at all without the equipoise of authority to authority. Authority to this wonderful line. There'd be no responsibility at all without the okay. I need another word for this so people understand it. Equipoise. It's nice big it's a 50-cent word, right? The balance of forces. Equipoise. Force point to point. A balance of force. Synonym: balance, evenness, symmetry. Pose. A balance of counterbalancing something. Without an equipoise of authority to authority. The situation in which the omnipotence of the state appears directly, Montesquieu used the word despotism. For him, for the 18th century in general, the word dictatorship was dependent upon the classical tradition and tied to the Roman Republic. Therefore, he conceived only commissary dictatorship as occurring within the existing republican constitution. From the time of Montesquieu's mentioning of the favorite textbook example from Sulla and Caesar. In other words, from time to time, Montesquieu mentions the favorite textbook examples of Sulla and Caesar. He used them without making comments, apart from psychological ones. Okay, this is interesting now. So look at note 19. So in Montesquieu's dialogue, Sylla and Ecrit, 1722, as well as chapter 8 and chapter 13 of his considerations on the cause and grandeur of the Romans and their decadence, decline, right? 1721. In chapter 8, dictator appears as a political instrument in the struggle between patricians and plebes. Montesquieu does not mention the fact that the dictator was a military commander in that sense. So therefore, it's a class structure in that sense. In tune with the political literature of the 17th century, which on the subject was not different from that of Klemperis, he viewed dictatorship essentially as a state of emergency in an aristocratic form of government. Spirit of Laws, Book 2, Chapter 3. A minority that was threatened in the dominance, in its domination, has delegated unlimited authorities. Une authority extraordinaire, right? An extraordinary authority to a single citizen. By contrast, monarchy, for which it was essential that the single person should exercise this authority extraordinaire, right? Exorbitant authority, right? That it is essential that the single person should exercise this right, generates the monarchical principle of paying heed to the intermediate powers, the aristocracy in particular. Chapter Abid, that same book, chapter 4 of book 2, right? As a restraint. For aristocratic states, Montesquieu recommends the establishment of a constitutional dictatorship. For the aristocratic states, Montesquieu recommends this establishment of constitutionship as had happened in Rome and attempted in Venice under a stable and permanent administration. But the institution of Venice promoted an omnipotent secret office which was operating there. And then the ambition of a single person fused with that of a single family. And the ambition of a single family fused that with a several ruling families. So, therefore, his point about this Venice, and I said, it was best to curtail the unlimited aspects of the authority to exercise power through brevity of official tenure. It was best to curtail unlimited aspects of the authority to exercise power through brevity of official, shorter. Not, in other words, once you had this office, long permanent one, this became what it became. What he said, the secrecy of it. Therefore, the ambition of a single person fused that of a single family, and the ambition of a single family fused that with several families. Now, this is better to have it temporary. Again, I've always read book 6 of chapter 6 of book 11 about juries. About juries. And he's right. He talks about it's about jury, the jury temporary, but jury ad hoc. But don't take that also about an extraordinary matter, a body of commissary authority too. Schmitt Schmitt saw the jury and then saw the jury as almost a commissarial authority in that sense. I'm having more and more appreciation of Schmitt as a thinker now, because he's really got to the heart. He went deeper into Montesquieu than most people have ever done. In a way, I'm surprised. Now, this has been eye-opening reading of this thing. Right? He goes. It was best to curtail the unlimited power of the authority to exercise power through brevity of office tenure, right? As outlined in chapter 6 of book 11, in the ideal case of the right of separation of powers, there would be no dictatorship. Although the chapter describes a state of emergency in which the legislative and executive are empowered for a brief and rigorously defined period of time to arrest suspicious citizens. The preconditions of this state of exception was a domestic conspiracy or negotiations with external enemies. Nevertheless, Montesquieu's historic eye did not overlook to the general significance of the extraordinary commissars for the transition of the Republic to Caesarism. In the book he devoted to the greatness and downfall of Rome, right? Chapter 11, right? He praises the prudent distribution of public powers in Rome, where the greatest number of magistrates restrained and controlled one another, so that each one had only a limited power, right? This is in other words, to provide limited power, to provide limited, no. So, a pouvoir bon had to, provide limits, had only a pouvoir bonnet, provide limits in a sense. This state of separation of powers ceased when commissions extraordinary commissions, right? This ceased when extraordinary commissions started being mandated. So therefore, the separation of powers of these known powers like this. In other words, all the existing system of councils and officials checking officials, and that this guy could check. One council can check that council. So therefore, you had this mediating situation. But then the separations of powers ceased when this extraordinary commission started being mandated, such as the ones of Sulla and Pompeius received. In this way, both the power of the people and that of the magistrates were annihilated, and the influential individuals were able to seize sovereign power. Right? Civil wars were the appropriate soil for such usurpation because they generated dictatorship. Montesquieu's example are Louis XIII and Louis XIV in France, Cromwell in England, and the absolutist princes of the 30-Year War. Unlimited power was exercised under the pretext of restoring order, and what in the past had been called freedom was now called uproar and disorder. One could perhaps understand from a historical political perspective, though, though, though not at all from the factual content of what Montesquieu says. In other words, one could understand this from the historical perspective, but but through not all, at all from the factual contents of what Montesquieu says. How it was possible to detect a spirit akin to that of the, in other words, how was it possible to detect a spirit akin to that of Rousseau's Contrat Social in someone who presented such a view of the origins of the modern state? In other words, this idea, how could you see Rousseau here? One could not understand from a historic this idea. How do you get this? How do you get this Rousseau? In other words, how can one, from perspective, get to from Montesquieu to this social contract? Right? Montesquieu's statement, Montesquieu's social contract, and someone who presented such a view of the origins of the modern state, right? Of the sense. Montesquieu's statement, frequently quoted since the French Revolution, that under special circumstances, freedom needs to be disguised, just as the statues of the deities were veiled, was made in a different context from the one in which it's usually cited. So therefore, this is important. Montesquieu's light says, the behavior of the most free people that had ever lived on earth makes me think that there are cases where you should cover freedom in a veil for just a while, just as you hide the statue of the guards, right? So it has a very specific context, he's saying, right? Namely, it was not about justifying the state of siege. It was rather the question of whether a bill of attainder were permissible. Yes, exactly. In other words, this question was not about the state, about justifying a state of siege in that sense, but rather whether it was permissible that a bill a bill of attainder, which is a legal killing, an instrument of killing people legally. The worrying aspect of such a bill was that one particular individual, a private citizen, was punished under the form of law. That is, one made an exception to the general characteristic of law. The law should be a norm valid to everyone. It should not only be applied to one individual case. At work here is the idea of law as the general will, the volonté générale. The universal character of law should consist in the fact that it does not know any individuality and it is valid without exception, like natural law. This conception of law, taken by Montesquieu and Rousseau from Cartesian philosophy, in which Montesquieu was acquainted mainly through the study of Malmbach, and where his scientific interests are rooted. So let's go look at the notes again here. And I'm going to just, so the conception of law, so 21 here, this is the repercussions of Aristotelian scholastic understanding of lex as a universe, as universal, are not at stake here. So therefore, this is idea. This is not that. This is so therefore, it's that law is universal, not at stake here. Put Malmbach note. This is 23. The important evidence is supplied by Ubub, Montesquieu, and Cartesius, who demonstrated the exact congruence between the central sentences of Montesquieu and that of Malmbach is frequently overlooked, whereas all kinds of dependence of Montesquieu on those on the ideas of those of Aristotle, Machiavelli, Baton, and Vico, and Bolingbroke are connected between them, are usually emphasized. So therefore, Malmbach is much important to this as the natural sciences, the physical science, to Descartes. This idea became paradigmatic in French political philosophy. whereas in the 17th century, the principle of the free ecclesiastical community was applied to political corporations in England and helped to create a new form of state in America. 18th century France politicized a metaphysical and scientific concept of law. So, whoa. Okay, this is another one of those super duper, Schmittian moments here. So let me continue. We're almost there. I think I'm going to hit this. This is getting, big in that sense. So if the English idea is a corporation, in other words, the free ecclesiastical community is applied to a political corporations, right, in England, and helped them to create a new form of state in America, the states and colonies in that sense. Particularly New England, right? This is Tocqueville's analysis of the corporate entities and town governments and things like that. Very interesting in that sense. But then the Cartesian doctrine of God. French politicized a medical and scientific concept of law. In this sense, right? The Cartesian doctrine of God possessed nothing but a volunteer general will, and any particularity was alien to its nature, and was translated into the idea that the state was only allowed to establish universal and abstract rules, the laws. So therefore, the Cartesian doctrine of God was nothing but a general will in that sense, will generale, and that again, this is Mellenbach, right? As Descartes as this was, in that any particularity was alien to his nature and was politically translated into the idea that the state was only allowed to establish universal and absolute abstract rules, the laws. The concrete individual case could only be decided through submission, submission. I can't get this word. Okay, let's look at this word. I want to get this word correct. Oh, damn it. It's substituted or put through under a universal, and it was done through a the concrete thing has to be done through a universal law. In other words, but not directly through law. When Descartes writes to Marinaz, it's okay. This is that line. Is God who has laid down these laws in nature, just as the king lays down laws in his kingdom. This is no accidental comment. Descartes, volume 3. Here is the basis of the occasionalism of Malenbach, who had a great influence not only on Montesquieu but also on Rousseau. There must be occasional causes that set the laws general laws in motion. Otherwise, God would have to set them in motion, and that could only have happened by a particular will. One must grasp this metaphysics in order to understand the argument of the social contract. Again, in other words, it's not a general will. In other words, it's the particular will only takes place in light of the logical outcomes of this mechanism. Otherwise, if it's going to be this particular thing, it is a particular will, not a general will. By the way, it should be mentioned that the image of the balance of passions, the balance des passions, balance of passion, can already be found in Malenbach. The idea of that only God has the volontaire general and immediate, the general and immediate will, immutable will, and that every other volontaire particular, special desire, right, particular desire, is against his dignity. His dignity dominates the philosophy of the 17th century and 18th century, like an axiom from Descartes and Malenbach down to Leibniz. Eric Kaufmann has the merit of having demonstrated with great such clarity how a theory of state is connected to the philosophy of time. Okay, this is under study of Stadler and the monarchical principle, and his, you know, on the concept of organism and political theory in the 19th century, and also his comments in his work of the clause as things stated. Um, an abstract concept of law in the 18th century. See Emile Laske's Fichte's. Okay, Fichte's. This is that. Philosophy of history. Fichte's philosophy of history. So not directly through law. This concept of law, combined with the other ideas, is especially evident. So I did that already, right? Let's do this again. And then remember, so by contrast, Montesquieu treatment of the question make it evident how little his political ideas were governed by doctrinary rationalism, in spite of the fact that he too, in Cicero's footsteps, called the law a usum in one, command for all. In other words, that law is a usum in onus, in everything, universe, command for all. Notwithstanding his concerns, he approved of this bill of attainder. In other words, even though it should be a bill of attainder necessary, it has to be done, right? This claim that the law must be universal did not entail an abstraction from any concrete content, as it did in Rousseau. So therefore, the claim from Montesquieu, is not come from what that the law must be universal does not entail from an abstraction from a concrete context, as it did in Rousseau. Rather, it followed politically from the same idea as Locke's antecedent standing law. In other words, that Locke's antecedent standing law, it's the law that's before the law. An unchangeable and immutable constant law should guarantee uniformity and predictability in the practices of the law. And thus, through its legal certainty, it should also guarantee the independence of the judge and constitute civil liberty. So therefore, and that through Locke, in other words, it it precluded an instrumental legislator and an instrumental jurisprudence that would decide on case by case basis according to specific circumstances. And it ensured what modern theorists of the states have called the inviolability of law, which is essential to any constitutional Riksdagen order, as opposed to the kind that obtains in the police state, right? So 24, that's just, so let me get this clear. He says, the claim that rule must be not entail from abstraction but concrete as it didn't, rather it followed from the politically the same idea as Locke of antecedent standing of law. In other words, it's the nature of law itself. It doesn't come from a general. It doesn't come from Rousseau, that it comes from a concrete content. Rather, it comes from this an antecedent standing law in that sense, an unchangeable, immutable. Constant law should guarantee uniform and predictability and patience of law. Thus, it should also guarantee this independence of the judge and the civil liberty. It precludes an instrumental legislature and the instrumental prudence that would decide case by case basis, according to specific circumstances, and semicolon, and it ensured what modern theories of state have called the inviolability of law, which is which is essential to any constitutional order, as opposed to the kind that obtains in a police state. The most important guarantees of the liberties, though, was located in the intermediate powers. There was the most important guarantees of civil liberties, though, was located in intermediate powers, and that's not through law itself, not through law. Montesquieu's famous statement about the judiciary, which he called the third power, besides the legislative and executive, but was in a certain sense to be invisible and void, invisible and void, did not seem to be associated. I got no. Hey, let's look at this one here. He says, not seem to be associated with the. Okay, let's repeat this again. I got interrupted and I lost my track. Most important guarantees of, in other words, the most important guarantees of stability, though, was located in the intermediate powers, right? This he said. Montesquieu's famous statement about judiciary, which are called the third power, besides the legislative and executive, but which in a certain sense should be invisible and void, did not seem to be associated with a rationalist understanding of the voluntary, the will general. Okay, okay, general will, I think, right? Yeah, general will. And that's, I'm stop here. Semicolon 25. Eric Kaufman. This is again. This is Kaufman. Nor did he imply that the judge was only a slavish applicant of the law to the individual case, a voice of law, la broche qua prononce les paroles des lois, the mouth that utters the word of the law. And inanimate creature, etrux inanimi, what the free movement of law in the last decades has called the automat of submit. In other words, this is the last decade with this the idea of the law should simply just do this. An automat of submission. In other words, it's not one of them. The judges shouldn't be just okay. This is what the rule says. In other words, he has discretion in that sense. He has, in other words, he is not that merely just arbitrate of that thing. He has prudence. He has like that. And that the last decade has been called the automat of submission. But another interpretation is more faithful to the spirit and context of both chapter 6 and the entire work, when he describes legal practice as invisible and void in some sense. Montesquieu has the idea of English jurors at the back of his mind. Those jurors did not establish a permanent body like the French court, and they were not a corpus immediate body. Right here, Montesquieu is far from the absolutism of the absolute validity of an abstract sentence. In a sentence, in other words, here Montesquieu is far from the absolutism of the absolute validity of a abstract sentence. In other words, this is interesting. It's not the it's a it's not a permanent body. At the French courts in that sense they were not also immediate corp intermediaire in that a despotism legal despotism such as the one demanded by French rationalism of the 18th century did not exist for him. So therefore, this is a very interesting moment of that. Not even Voltaire's elaborated, not even Voltaire elaborated the consequences of doctrine of dictatorship of the enlightened rationality. Of course, he was a friend of enlightened despotism. For Voltaire, that what Montesquieu had said about the justification of bribery and the hereditary bestowal of functions, practice developed in the context of the theory of intermediate powers, was disgraceful and infamous. So therefore, in other words, okay, Voltaire looks at what Montesquieu is saying about this, all these intermediate powers and the need for this, and it's corruption. This is just this is outrageous. She should be rational. She should be it was disgraceful, infamous. And the struggle between royal absolutism and the parliaments between 1756 and 1771, he sided with the central powers, and the parliament's resistance was for him a baffling form of anarchy. When it functioned well, the apparatus of bureaucracy, which was controlled through pressures from a central institution, corresponded to his deistic worldview, whereas the colorful model of feudal autonomy and autonomy of estates appeared to him as sheer chaos. On this, okay, this is his criticism, Voltaire's criticisms of Montesquieu, right? Nevertheless, he recognized the positive aspects of democracy only too well, and the natural malice of human beings had already armed him with enough skepticism about absolutist psychology, for him to be able to be an unconditional absolutist. Right. This is number 27. See Democratie in the same works by of Voltaire's dictionary. in his clause, if man is born wicked or man is born bad, in Voltaire's dialogues, and philosophic interviews, right? There is no specific entry on dictatorship in dictionary philosophy. Right? No specific dictatorship. So he was not, he's okay. He was, he really didn't like the chaos, but he also was a snuff cynic and distrusted absolute rulers to see democracy a little better in that sense, right? To be an unconditional absolutist. Moreover, it was not certain. It was certainly not part of his intellectual nature to pursue systematically the consequence of an idea. So he wasn't, he didn't take an idea and go through it. By contrast, you will find the fundamental idea, which derives from common enmity between the historic immediate powers, together with the common belief in the powers of the enlightened bureaucracy, in the philosophic economists, the 18th century economists, the physiocrats, Dupont de Nemours, Bandler, Sinek de Limin, and also in the Hombach system social, which repeated all of the Lockean comments concerning the despot through natural, that is, rationalistic abstract thinking, a universally valid political and social order and justice could be developed, which had to be developed at the governmental level. So let's go look at this. I want to see some of these notes. Physiocrat. No, he said, he says, I've used the Eugene Dadde's physiocrats like this. I hear we have to do consider his natural law and his maxim general. I think um, Dupont, this is correspondence, right? He says, Dupont and Navarro were together with the old Malbu and Bishop, co-editors of the reporters of this newspaper, which Malby considers the most important document for the despotic legalism, legal despotism of the physiocrats, alongside with Messer de Rivera, right? And then again, he goes those all these specific cases, but Locke, he goes polar box, so system social, which repeated all of Locke's convincing, right? This concerning the despot, right? The arbitrary thing. No, it shouldn't be arbitrary. Although natural, that is, rationalistic abstract thinking, a universally valid political and social order, and the judge could be developed, which had to be developed at the general governmental level. Although the physiocrats regarded any interference from the state in trade and commerce as a detrimental thing, a strong monarchy and a true despotism, in other words, an authorized and intelligent one, appeared to them as inevitable if one was to achieve the liberal ideas and destruction of the intermediate powers which stood in their way. The state had to be subject to the laws of economic development, but apart from that, it's superseded everything else. And its main task had to be the enlightenment and the education of the subject. I'm kind of still going on. I'm kind of a little nervous because I think I'm almost at the end of my point, but I'm kind of nervous about it because I think I went too far. No, I didn't. I didn't. I'm okay. I'm getting there. Uh, let's continue. Once human beings had realized the natural order, the order natural, their natural order, everything else would follow automatically. Again, this sounds like liberalism, modern liberalism. Until the moment the domination of the enlightened authority was necessary, of course, it completed the task of enlightening people by using coercion if necessary, and the ends of education justified these coercive means. The ideal country is China, while the bureaucracy learned mandates. Peter the Great's methods of government are also praised, as those of Catherine II. Voltaire had already defended Russia against the Montesquieu and rejected the accusation that it was a dictatorship, although not entirely for factual reasons, but also out of the respect for Catherine II. The example of the idealization of China in the 18th century is found in the Fresh Shift to Gustav Smiller's 1908, and also in Montesquieu's, see also Montesquieu's Ancient Regime, Book 2, Chapter 3. Um, if then human beings were educated so as to use their reason, an enlightened public opinion would emerge, which was more suited to control the government than any other established authority were. A man of practical and political intellectual significance, like a Turgot, um, denied the particular bodies any right of existence within the state where the public utility was concerned. So this was Turgot would go say there's no particular bodies have no rights that contradicted the public utility was concerned. This was the supreme law, and it must not be equated with the superstition and respect for any tradition. So, my God, this is Turgot's, this is the physiocrat. The consequent formulation and the naming of this theory of state was elaborated by Le Messer in his book, The Natural and Essential Order of Political Societies. Oh, God, this is, again, modern liberalism. This is the modern. This you go back to the French Revolution. Oh God, this has been. He developed a system of despotism, legal despotism, on the basis of the most universal principle of reason. Reason dictates. His despotism did not have as its goals the slavery of human beings. On the contrary, it aimed to give them true freedom and cultivation. The despotisme legal was designated from the despotisme arbitraire, arbitrary despotism, through its object, in other words, rational things like this. Nevertheless, it was a personal despotism, the despotism of the one who recognized its evident truth, the one who possessed right, natural, and essential insight. Was permitted to be the despot over the one who did not possess this insight or who refused it. So therefore, the rule it was a personal despotism. That you once you recognize reason and right reason, and then you had a right to dictate those who did not do that. Right. Of course, even for Mercer, the most severe obstacle to the domination of reason, were the human passions. Hence, passion needed to be enslaved through the use of force, if need be, for the right to dictate laws, dicter les lois, just on its own, without physical force, was not sufficient to establish these laws. For this reason, the separation of the legislative from the executive was reprehensible, too, and also futile. Inevitably, these two powers must be balanced. Yeah, inevitably, these two powers must be balanced. There would always be dominance of one over the other in the long run. The theory of checks and balances, the counterforces, was a chimera, fake thing. In other words, this is dicter les lois positive es chess commander. To command is to dictate positive law. And this also implied having the force public power without any legislation, without which any legislation would would be impotent. To suspend the separation of powers was to suspend the separation of powers was the constitutional definition of despotism. Right, this is underway. The Staatslichler, the definition of despotism in that sense. In the interest of an uncompromised action, all opposing obstacles were abolished, and an irresistible power, an exercible power, or an authority irresistible, irresistible authority was created. The key, the key term in this theory was unity. Un seul force, un seul volontaire, one single force, one single will. A unity of evidence, power, and authority in which despotism was based on the recognition of the true laws of social order. Consequently, the true interest of the sovereign was identical with the true interest of the governed, and the power of the despot could be all the greater, while all the greater, the more widely enlightenment had spread. So, therefore, in other words, consequently, the true interest of the sovereign was identical with the true interest of the governed, and the power of the despot could all be the power of the despot could be all of them greater, with the more widely enlightenment had spread, because then the rectification of power emerged automatically with public opinion. This legal despotism was not despotism bound to positive law, but rather a radically centralized political power that secured the transition to a situation in which the natural laws ruled by themselves and which the evidence of rationality constituted their justification. On this, I'm going to stop what it's 36. This is again, this is the title here. This is Euclid is the true despot, and the geometrical truths that he handed down to us are the truly despotic rules. Their legal despotism and the personal despotism of the legislature account to one and the same, that the irresistible force of evidence. Now I can see why Lincoln's a tyrant. Lincoln's logic, Abraham Lincoln, in his understanding of things, used to love Euclid. He used to use Euclid as this justification of reasoning. You cannot use this kind of systemic reasoning at the realm of politics. This is even more interesting, that political reasoning cannot be based on this kind of deductive reasoning skill. This kind of deductive reasoning skill is absolute. It has no room for anything but the authority of the things. It's dogmatic and it's absolute. Interesting. I mean, in that sense, Schmitt. Oh God, this has been a very powerful chapter. If you have any comments, questions, I'm gonna stop here. This is where I'm supposed to stop. Please put your comments and questions there below. I will. If you have any themes, dramatic, or wish to do it, please bring it up. This is probably a long. I don't know. I'm real afraid it's over an hour. If you like it, please hit the like button. Share it around with people. If you've not subscribed, do subscribe. Encourage others to subscribe. Let's grow it. If you didn't like it, you can always thumbs down, but please say why in the comments. Another thing is, you want to follow me on social media, please follow me. The links are below, so my social media links. If you want to follow my scholarship, what I am doing in scholarship and things like that, my academic social media links are below. You can find this, some social media, the academic social media sites that has my research and papers. Another thing you can do is, if you want to help me to do what I do, you want to contribute, help, join, you can do so through Subscribe Star and Patreon. These are the mechanisms you can do it. I don't really have big tiers and things like that. People complain, oh, you're not doing anything there. Well, this is a small way you can help. Maybe just help. I should have like a jar. Too bad there's not a website you can have this jar, like a jar. Please throw me a penny or throw me $1 or $2 into the dime. I don't have monetization, so I don't get that. So I'm too small for that. So it'd be nice, right? Another thing you can do, again. You can buy one of my books. The books are listed. My 3 of the published books that I've done are listed below. You can order it through online news sources if you want, online book sources. Just copy the book link and find it. You can order it through Amazon or any of the online sources, or you can go to your local bookstore. That's it. We're going to finish up next time we're going to meet. We're going to finish the second part of this. Which continues this chapter 3 on the 18th century. We'll move towards we will move towards the kind of response to Montesquieu, the rationalists, the centralists, and then and last, but I think last not least, the last half is Rousseau and and the French Revolution. Okay, so therefore that's the stop here. Um, Again, Schmitt is always Tuesdays and Thursdays. Rousseau should be Rousseau or something else are doing on Mondays and Wednesdays, and uh, uh, Fridays are either live stream or messing around or something like that. Okay, take care. Okay, bye bye. Have a good day. See you soon. Take care. Bye bye.